The story began in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns and identical flower beds defined the very essence of community pride. Every front yard looked almost cloned from the next. Trimmed grass no higher than 3 inches, tidy rows of shrubs that had been clipped into geometric shapes, and decorative mulch that gave each property the same magazine-perfect aesthetic. For some residents, this was the dream. For others, it was conformity to an extreme degree. In this neighborhood, one homeowner had taken a different approach. Instead of spending weekends pushing a mower across a flat green carpet, he allowed his yard to breathe and grow. Grass was not cut on a strict schedule. Wildflowers sprouted in corners that most people would consider weeds, and vines wrapped naturally around the wooden fence. To the average passerby, it wasn't a yard that looked abandoned or uncared for. It simply looked alive. Birds swooped in frequently. Bees hovered around blossoms, and squirrels darted through the tall stalks with ease. It was an evolving habitat, and the homeowner found peace in it. But in every neighborhood, there's always someone who sees individuality as defiance. That someone was a woman named Karen. Known for walking her small dog at precisely 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., she considered herself the unofficial inspector of all things aesthetic. If a car was parked too close to a curb, she reported it. If a mailbox leaned slightly forward, she documented it. And when her eyes landed on this unconventional front yard, she labeled it something else entirely. In her mind, it wasn't a garden. It wasn't a natural retreat, it was a jungle. She whispered it to her friends on the HOA board. She muttered it under her breath when she walked past. Soon enough, the phrase caught on, and people began snickering about the jungle house down the street. What started as gossip quickly escalated into a formal complaint. The HOA sent letters, citing violations of landscaping rules. They claimed the grass exceeded the acceptable height, that unapproved vegetation had been planted, and that the yard disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. To them, conformity was harmony. Anything different was chaos. But the homeowner wasn't moved by their words. He saw something none of the others could. While his neighbors prided themselves on lawns that looked like lifeless carpets, he noticed butterflies appearing in numbers larger than before. He noticed bees pollinating his flowers and then traveling across the block, indirectly helping other residents' gardens. He noticed how children passing by would sometimes pause, marveling at the dragonflies hovering above the taller grasses. The so-called jungle wasn't disorder, it was balance. Still, Karen pressed harder. She walked past with her phone out, snapping pictures of what she labeled as neglect. She emailed board members daily, demanding fines and escalated enforcement. She called the property an eyesore. To her, a neighborhood was only as valuable as its image, and this yard was threatening that image. She envisioned property values plummeting if anyone dared to break the mold. Yet every push from her created an equal pull in the opposite direction. The more she mocked, the more determined the homeowner became to defend the space. Instead of trimming it down to fit in, he researched the history of natural landscaping. He discovered that native plants provided shelter and food for pollinators that were disappearing due to pesticides and urban sprawl. He learned that lawns, though pretty, consumed massive amounts of water and contributed little to the environment. And then he found something else, an idea that would flip the entire conflict upside down. There existed a program, managed by national conservation organizations, that allowed individuals to certify their property as a wildlife habitat. The requirements were clear: provide food, water, shelter, and sustainable practices for local species. With the variety of wildflowers, shrubs, and natural water collection already present, the yard met most of the standards. With a few additional tweaks, like adding a bird bath and a small feeder, it would qualify. As Karen escalated her war of complaints, the homeowner quietly filled out paperwork, submitted photographs, and documented every feature of the yard. What the HOA saw as a violation, environmental organizations saw as a thriving micro-habitat. Weeks later, while Karen was plotting her next HOA meeting ambush, a large envelope arrived. Inside was a certificate of recognition. The property had been officially registered as a certified wildlife habitat. Along with the paperwork came a sign, a small but powerful emblem declaring the property protected as an ecozone. The moment the sign was posted in the yard, everything changed. What had been called messy was now legally validated. What Karen had mocked as a jungle was now recognized as intentional and important. The very vines and flowers she sneered at were now shielded by conservation authority. The ripple effect began almost instantly. Neighbors walking by noticed the sign and grew curious. Some, previously annoyed by the unconventional yard, began to see it differently. Instead of rebellion, they now saw purpose. Children asked their parents what a wildlife habitat meant. Parents who once scowled now found themselves explaining the importance of protecting pollinators. But for Karen, it was a nightmare. The thing she had fought so hard against was now beyond her control. The HOA's rules couldn't override federal and state-level environmental protections. They couldn't fine someone for following conservation laws. They couldn't mow down what was now certified as protected land. Her whispers of jungle no longer carried weight. Instead, the sign in the yard told a louder story than her voice ever could. Still, she wasn't finished. Karen was not the kind of person who backed down easily. If anything, the official certification only fueled her anger. She saw it not as a loss, but as a challenge. If the yard could become a wildlife habitat, what else might happen? Would more neighbors copy the idea? Would the pristine uniformity of the neighborhood unravel? Would her power within the HOA slip away? In her mind, the yard wasn't just a patch of land. It was a threat to the order she believed she upheld. And if she couldn't silence it with fines or reports, she would have to find another angle. The homeowner, however, was already 2 steps ahead. He knew Karen wouldn't stop. He knew the HOA would continue to pressure him in subtle ways. But with the habitat certification in hand, he also knew he had leverage they could never take away. What began as a defense against harassment was slowly becoming something bigger, a vision for transforming not just his yard, but the entire neighborhood. And that vision would soon grow roots deeper than anyone expected. The battle was far from over. The jungle was only the beginning. The certificate on the homeowner's porch was more than a piece of paper. It was a shield, a declaration that what had been mocked as neglect was in fact recognized as something vital. The sign in the yard was small, but it carried an authority greater than any letter Karen or the HOA could send. For the first time since the conflict began, the homeowner felt a quiet power. But with power came attention. The neighbors who had once walked past with tight lips and judgmental glances now slowed their steps. Some stopped to read the sign, snapping pictures on their phones. Parents explained to children that the yard was now a certified wildlife habitat. Words like eco-friendly and protected floated through conversations that weeks earlier had been filled with complaints about weeds and messiness. It was a slow shift at first. A curious teenager asked about the butterflies clustering near the milkweed. A young couple walking their dog stopped to admire the colorful blooms. An older neighbor, usually one of Karen's allies, found herself intrigued by the number of finches gathering in the yard. What had once been framed as an eyesore was starting to be seen as something beautiful. Karen noticed the shift too, and it filled her with unease. She had expected the certification to be a minor bump, something she could overcome with persistence. But the sign didn't fade into the background the way she hoped. Instead, it became a point of pride for others, and pride was dangerous in her eyes. At the next HOA meeting, Karen's frustration erupted. She waved photographs of the jungle yard and demanded that exceptions be stripped away. She argued that the sign was nothing more than a loophole, that the certification was meaningless compared to the community standards everyone had agreed to uphold. She painted a dramatic picture of property values sinking, of buyers refusing to move into a neighborhood overrun with weeds. But as she spoke, a quiet tension filled the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down at their papers, unwilling to meet her eyes. It was becoming clear that the tide was turning. The yard, once a target, was now drawing curiosity and even admiration. Still, the HOA tried to push back. Letters were mailed, carefully worded this time, avoiding direct conflict with the certification. Instead of fines for the plants, they focused on secondary issues: the placement of a bird bath, the supposed attraction of wildlife deemed nuisance animals, the potential for mosquitoes due to standing water. Every claim was vague, every accusation a grasp at control. But the homeowner had anticipated this. He had already taken steps to ensure everything in his yard met the exact guidelines for wildlife habitats. The bird bath was maintained regularly to prevent mosquito larvae. The feeders were kept clean. The plants were native and approved by state conservation lists. Every potential point of attack had already been considered and neutralized. With every letter the HOA sent, the homeowner sent back documentation, proof and polite reminders of the habitat's protected status. The board grew frustrated, but there was nothing more they could do. That's when something unexpected began to happen. A neighbor 2 houses down, inspired by the idea, planted native flowers along her fence line. Another neighbor across the street stopped mowing his backyard so often, letting clover and wild grasses grow in patches. Slowly, other residents started adding small touches: bee houses, bird feeders, butterfly-friendly plants. What began as one yard labeled a jungle was spreading quietly into a movement. Karen seethed as she walked her daily route. Every new flower bed felt like a personal betrayal. Every bird feeder hung in defiance of her vision of the neighborhood. She tried to shame people into compliance, reminding them of the rules, but the energy she once commanded was slipping away. Meanwhile, the homeowner's yard thrived. The tall stalks swayed in the breeze, dotted with blossoms of every color. Monarch butterflies became regular visitors, their orange wings flickering like lanterns. Bees hummed busily, undeterred by the gossip of humans. Birds nested in the shrubs, their morning songs filling the air. The once quiet corner of the street had become a living ecosystem, richer and louder than it had ever been. And then the local newspaper got wind of it. A journalist, tipped off by a curious resident, reached out to the homeowner. An article was published about the certified wildlife habitat, highlighting it as a model for suburban eco-conscious living. The piece framed the yard as an inspiring example of how small individual choices could make a difference in protecting pollinators and preserving biodiversity. The response was overwhelming. Readers praised the initiative. Comments rolled in from people across the city, some saying they wished their neighborhoods had more yards like this. A few even drove by just to see it for themselves. For Karen, it was a nightmare realized. The jungle she despised was no longer just a local nuisance. It was now celebrated, admired, and validated on a public scale. Instead of being a laughingstock, the homeowner had become a local hero. But Karen wasn't finished. If the HOA couldn't stop the yard, she would find another way. She began filing complaints with the city, claiming that the habitat attracted vermin, that it violated health codes, that it was unsafe for children. Inspectors came, but each time they found nothing wrong. The yard met every standard. Her desperation became obvious, and neighbors began to distance themselves from her. People who once joined her in whispered complaints now rolled their eyes when she launched into another tirade. Slowly, her power base within the community eroded. Yet even as Karen lost influence, the homeowner realized the fight wasn't just about one yard anymore. It was about the principle of individuality against conformity, about the right to live in harmony with nature rather than against it. And so he leaned further into the idea. He applied for grants to expand the habitat with more native plantings. He hosted small gatherings where children could learn about pollinators and ecosystems. What began as a defense mechanism was becoming a source of education and inspiration. The irony was sharp. Karen had wanted to destroy the yard. Instead, she had unintentionally sparked a neighborhood transformation. Her attempts to shame had only brought attention. Her attempts to silence had only amplified the story. But with transformation came new challenges. Not everyone embraced the changes. Some residents worried about what it meant for property values long-term. Others still grumbled about the messy look compared to the clean, uniform lawns they were used to. And Karen, though weakened, was still plotting in the background, looking for her next move. The stage was set for the final act. What started as one yard mocked as a jungle had now become a recognized, celebrated eco-zone. Neighbors were following the example, the media was paying attention, and the HOA was cornered. But Karen wasn't done, and the true test of the movement's resilience was yet to come. By the time summer reached its height, the yard was no longer just a yard, it had become a symbol. The once ordinary lawn that Karen mocked as unkempt was now alive in every sense, plants bursting with blossoms, bees drifting from flower to flower, butterflies dancing on the breeze, and birds swooping overhead in flashes of color. The transformation was complete, and the homeowner could feel the difference each time he stepped outside. What was once viewed as a battleground of neighborhood politics was now celebrated as a sanctuary. But as always, peace was temporary when Karen was involved. She had not disappeared, nor had she surrendered. She was waiting, biding her time, and when she struck again, it was with the full force of her stubbornness. Her final campaign began quietly, with letters slid into mailboxes at night. They were printed on plain white paper, unsigned but unmistakably hers. The words were filled with warnings, claims that the wildlife habitat was a danger to children, that predators would soon follow the smaller animals, that disease would spread through the neighborhood. She painted it as not just a nuisance, but a looming threat. Some neighbors laughed it off, others grew uneasy. A few whispered that perhaps Karen was right, that perhaps letting nature back in was a mistake. Fear, even when unfounded, had a way of spreading quickly. Karen fed that fear at every opportunity. She took pictures of rabbits nibbling at the edges of flower beds and claimed they were infestations. She snapped photos of squirrels and declared them dangerous carriers. She pointed to every patch of untrimmed grass as proof of chaos. Her obsession twisted the narrative, trying to undo everything the habitat had accomplished, but the homeowner had learned by now how to respond. He didn't argue directly with her, didn't sink to her level of accusations and whispers. Instead, he focused on transparency. He invited city officials, conservationists, and even local teachers to visit the habitat. They inspected, they studied, and every single one of them praised the project. Reports were written, photos were shared, and educational programs sprouted from the yard. It was no longer just a personal choice, it was becoming a public good. Karen, however, doubled down. Her most dramatic move came when she filed an emergency petition with the HOA board to revoke the homeowner's right to maintain the habitat. She claimed it violated safety codes, disrupted the neighborhood's character, and threatened to bring down property values. It was the same song she had been singing since the beginning, but this time she added an edge of desperation. The board called a meeting. The room filled with residents, more than had attended in months. The atmosphere was tense, divided between those tired of Karen's crusade and those nervous about change. At the front, Karen stood stiff and righteous, her papers stacked neatly in front of her. The homeowner sat quietly, his documents ready, but before he even had a chance to present them, something remarkable happened. Neighbors began to speak. One after another, they stood to describe how the habitat had brought joy to their families. A mother described how her children spent afternoons watching butterflies instead of staring at screens. An elderly man shared how much comfort he found in hearing birdsong outside his window each morning. Another neighbor admitted that she had started planting her own wildflowers, inspired by the transformation she saw next door. The tide of voices grew, and with each story Karen's power diminished. She tried to interject to remind them of the rules, but the words fell flat. Rules meant nothing when weighed against the community's lived experience. When it was finally the homeowner's turn, he didn't need to argue. He simply presented the certificates, the inspection reports, the letters of support from city officials. The facts were undeniable. The habitat was legal, beneficial, and celebrated. The board, caught between Karen's demands and the overwhelming support of the community, had no choice but to relent. The petition was denied. The habitat would remain. Karen's face hardened as the decision was read. She gathered her papers, lips pressed thin, and stormed out of the room. For the first time in the long conflict, she had not just lost control, she had been publicly defeated. In the weeks that followed, her presence in the neighborhood faded. She still muttered complaints when passing by, but fewer people listened. The power she once wielded, the fear she once spread, was gone. She had isolated herself, and the community had moved on without her. Meanwhile, the habitat thrived more than ever. Grants provided funding for additional plantings. Volunteers from local schools came to help maintain it. The yard became a teaching ground, a gathering spot, even a quiet retreat for those who needed it. What had started as one person's stubborn defense of his yard had turned into something much larger. The irony was impossible to ignore. Karen had wanted to destroy what she saw as a jungle. Instead, she had amplified it, pushing it into the spotlight and ensuring its survival. Without her relentless attacks, it might never have grown into the landmark it had become. By autumn, the neighborhood was transformed. Gardens bloomed in more than one yard now, small habitats sprouting across the block. The street that had once been uniform and predictable was now alive with color, sound, and movement. Bees worked tirelessly, butterflies migrated through, birds nested comfortably. It was a living mosaic of life, stitched together by defiance and nurtured by resilience. And the homeowner, looking out at the yard one evening as the sun dipped low, finally felt the weight of the journey lift. The battles had been long, the accusations endless, the stress sometimes unbearable. But in the end, nature had won. The jungle was no longer a point of ridicule, it was a victory. Karen might never accept it, but that no longer mattered. The neighborhood had spoken, the city had spoken, the wildlife itself had spoken, filling the air with songs, wings, and blossoms. The yard, once mocked as messy, was now protected, celebrated, and unshakable. The jungle had become home.